Hi, Mary MacCarthy here with the Data Tea. Usually I start by saying live on LinkedIn, but today for the first time ever, we're experimenting and we're also going live on YouTube. So probably no one is watching over on YouTube yet, but you'll watch later. So first ever live stream on 2 platforms. Hopefully it goes great for this amazing historical experiment. For the Data Tea, I'm joined by PenneBaker. This is also a big deal to have Lee here because it's the first time ever I'm breaking the rule of only bringing in external guests to Hightouch. Data Tea is a high-touch show, and I always speak to people outside of our company. For the first time ever, I brought in somebody from inside Hightouch. So Lee, thanks for being here. I'll tell everybody why you're here in just a minute, but I'm delighted to have you.
Yeah, thank you. Excited and super nervous to be here, but more excited. Thank you for having me.
Well, the pressure's on, when you're representing the company, right? And you run our partnerships team. I love working alongside you. The topic of today's show, though, doesn't really have anything to do specifically with Hightouch or with partnerships. We're here to talk about Snowflake. We know that most people in our ecosystem, the modern data stack ecosystem, are headed to the Snowflake Summit next week, their big annual conference. So there's a lot of buzz around that, a lot of, frankly, stress, right? We're all kind of preparing for that this week. And what I wanted to do was not talk about the conference, but talk about why does Snowflake matter? We know that it's this giant corporation, but why? Why is it such a big deal? Why is it considered sort of the cornerstone or the beating heart of the modern data stack? And that's something that I think a lot of people don't really know. I sort of know only because I've talked to you. So you work for Hightouch, but you formerly worked for Snowflake. You've sort of watched the evolution of what they are. So I said, if I'm going to talk about Snowflake, dig into why it really matters, I'm going to get PenneBaker on. So I'm delighted that you're here as our unofficial Snowflake historian. Before we get into what Snowflake is, why it's so important, let's find out just a little bit about you. Lee, I know you are based in Denver. What else should we know about you and your background?
Yes. Well, as you mentioned before, I came from Snowflake previously. So Hightouch, we're a young company. So I've been at Snowflake for much longer than I've been at Hightouch for. I was on their data marketplace team where we were tasked with kind of productizing a feature of Snowflake that will likely become one of 2 long-term differentiators for the company as a whole. So we'll talk about what that is and what it means. But that's where I was before. I live in Denver with my wife, who I met on the Appalachian Trail, and we just live with our chickens and cats and a very happy, nice life here.
Love it. Love Denver. As you know, I spent a lot of time there. That's where I grew up. Even ran into you in the neighborhood recently. One of those
That's right.
IRL interactions that most of us aren't used to anymore. So that's awesome. And you bring this wealth of knowledge of Snowflake. And you're always teaching us here at Hightouch about what you learned there. So let's start with what makes Snowflake so special. We're not doing an advertisement for Snowflake by any means, but the fact of the matter is that it is considered, sort of the center of the modern data stack, the unbundled modern data stack in many ways. I think in order to really understand that, you have to go back to the dark ages. So I'm talking 2010, right? And what were people talking about when they talked about data warehouses or databases back in 2010, 2012?
Yeah, and it's a good question. I appreciate you saying this is not an advertisement. Snowflake is in a really interesting spot where they've gotten so big so quickly that now I think we kind of take it for granted that that's the way that things are in data. And where it was actually very special what Snowflake did, and yeah, as you said, things look super different 10 years ago. I'm also not a technical person, so I don't know technical ins and outs and whatnot. But at a very, very high level, I think what makes Snowflake special is that Snowflake inherently took the idea of the cloud to its logical extent with data. I think that's the tagline, if you will, of why Snowflake's cool. So going back in time, data, as we start getting all kinds of really cool databases, what that looks like, I don't know, 10 years ago, and for the previous however many decades before that. What it looked like is if you wanted to have a warehouse, if you will, or you wanted to start running analytics, and you didn't want to do it on just your laptop, you would have to buy servers and server racks, and you would have to buy, or you would have to hire people to come in and to manage those servers. So you had to pay for all of this hardware, and then you had to pay for all of this software, the management of each, and people who had different skills. And then you had the people who today, again, we take for granted as these data engineers or folks who actually run the modeling or the analytics. And that's like this pre-cloud world. And that's just kind of
But
how
what I imagine is those like endless hallways of giant servers, and then just as sort of the, example of how it's obviously that's a huge amount of space, cost, whatever. Also, like, I don't know, machines to cool all that. There's just all this like physical logistics that were involved when anything was pre-cloud days, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, and yeah, it's very costly. Also, there are some really big limitations at a technical level, which I'll just only hit the surface of, in the sense that if you want to have access to a certain amount of storage, like you have X amount of data you want to store, just the way that storage and compute, or the other resource for analytics being compute, i.e., I have data I want to ask questions about. Well, the data has to be stored in some place, and then it has with one resource, storage resource, and then it has to be queried, right? When I ask that question about how many of these do I have, or I want to join tables, whatever that is, I have to throw compute, this other resource, at that storage resource to get the answer that I want. And so in the beginning, if you wanted to have a certain amount of storage, that actually necessitated a certain amount of compute. And that wasn't based on like your needs as a company. It was just based on hardware limitations, where when you buy certain hardware for these servers, you get X amount of compute with X amount of storage. And companies, as I imagine people here listening and engineers today will know very, very well, that data isn't fixed like that. Like you might ask a lot of questions about a small amount of data, or you might have a ton of data that you ask very few questions about. Like maybe you have a ton of security logs, let's say, which is an insane amount of data, but you just don't ask questions of it too often. Or let's say you have like a really high value data set of like your purchasers who are most common in your website, and you want to ask tons of questions because you think that's the heart of your business. Small amount of data, a lot of compute. If you're buying your own server racks and whatnot, what happens is you have to buy the maximum amount of servers possible for that maximum of compute you want, regardless of storage, and vice versa. The point is scaling and stuff, really difficult, very costly. Really big companies had the ability to afford this, and even then it wasn't super performant. But what ends up happening is with really with Salesforce had this idea originally where they just said, hey, we'll actually host our own servers, us being Salesforce. We'll buy all this stuff, we'll manage it, whatever. And then we will sell you the software that you can access just by logging in with your own computer. And whenever you're storing data, or whenever you're asking questions of that data, you're just sending a request to the servers that we own and manage through your laptop or whatever. So now it doesn't actually matter the size of your company. It doesn't matter how many resources you have. You just have to buy a seat in Salesforce and then use all the hardware that they're managing for you. That kind of opened people's minds to the idea of, oh my gosh, like this could be very, very different than it is today. And Amazon really capitalized on that in the way of like databases. So Salesforce nailed it with CRMs, and they kind of beat out Siebel and really everyone else with that. But then you have AWS shows up. Amazon Web Services basically runs the planet in the way of internet and infrastructure. And they had a really cool idea. They said, why don't we do that same thing, but apply it to databases, data warehouses. So instead of doing what Salesforce did and host a CRM remotely and call it the cloud, right? You log in on your browser, you can now have a CRM instead of downloading it and having all your servers run it. They said, what if we actually hosted a company's like entire data store separately, and we manage all of those servers? So like not their CRM, but basically all of their data. That includes their CRM, probably all that data replicated into this database, in every other customer touch point, all that. We will host that separately and let our customers get access to that from just a website that's hosted by Amazon, so they can connect to this via their laptop, whatever it is, and get effectively unlimited resources. And that's where Amazon had a really opened the game in the way of a cloud-based data warehouse. They called that Redshift in the early 2010s. And I know it's like a super roundabout way of saying, like, getting to your question, but that's kind of the backdrop of like what everything looked like. We had massive servers, you had to own and manage. Then we have Amazon comes in, manages the servers themselves, and you can now plug in remotely. And then Snowflake kind of comes in and really takes that to the next step. But I've just talked a lot. I don't know if you have questions.
Before we get into Snowflake, just to make sure I fully understand, what you've described is basically the switch over to the cloud with Salesforce's way of doing that, sort of opening people's minds to it, and then Amazon doing a full-on saying we can host your entire data infrastructure for you on what we think of now as the cloud, which again is physical servers based somewhere in the world, hosted by Amazon. It's just that the customer doesn't have to think about that. It's all basically outsourced to them, right?
100%.
Okay. It's interesting. I didn't know Salesforce's role in that. I'll have to go back and read up on that in terms of the evolution of the technology. And then that's where we are. People are getting used to the idea of the cloud, or not the cloud, but like databases in the cloud, something like Amazon Redshift. But the problem with Amazon Redshift is it's not great in some ways, right? There's some limitation to it.
Yeah, exactly. So Redshift's awesome in figuring out in there, and I'm skipping steps, right? People were managing, there are different like cloud-based solutions for Redshift. There's all kinds of nuances here, but generally in a commercial sense, like Redshift was huge in the way of everyone knows that who AWS is. Everyone and their mom has an AWS account. And so why not, through that same account, procurement process, whatnot, with a trusted vendor, start using their version of a cloud-based data warehouse? So that's, the pros are awesome. They manage all the physical infrastructure. That's now done for you. Now, the cons are, if them being kind of the first, I'll say lowercase f, again, other people had done this before, but Amazon kind of being the first here, they didn't have the best software when they started out. They effectively ported over the software that you would typically use in an on-premise or pre-cloud solution into their cloud solution. So as you can imagine, it's like not the coolest software, right? It's been around for a while. You still need, now you're not hiring people to tune your hardware, but you're still hiring people to tune your software before the people who you've hired to like ask the questions of data can even get in there. And so I would say, generally speaking, that was the biggest limitation for Redshift, which again, in the moment is not a limitation because people are just so amped on the ability to just not, do this in the cloud anyways. And now you don't have the overhead of the folks managing the hardware. But what happens around this time is, and this is kind of, I'll go into like the story of like Snowflake's founding. I'm sure a lot of this, is myth or whatnot, but it's kind of a fun story anyways. Where, Amazon is not the big database player at the time. It's really Oracle. And Oracle had all kinds of amazing genius engineers where you want to work if you're working in databases. And a VC out in California has this idea, why don't we build a cloud database or data warehouse that is built for the cloud from the ground up. So Redshift is built kind of for the cloud, but not from the ground up in the way that their software works. Why don't we just do the whole thing from the ground up? So they find a couple of guys, database architects, folks who've built databases at Oracle. They said, hey, we'll basically bankroll this sucker if you just build a cloud data warehouse for us from the ground up. These guys say yes, and kind of the story writes itself from there. But these guys had the idea.
I don't think there's been a movie made yet, right?
I know. I could see it. It was like no tragic ending like the WeWork one. But what these guys basically do is they say they have all kinds of really cool innovations. Again, this is where I'm just painting with really broad strokes here. Mm-hmm. But in my opinion and understanding, among the like big differentiators they had, there's one that stuck out then that effectively, like, the consequences of that differentiator lead to all of the differentiators that matter today. In that differentiator, again, in my eyes, is the ability to separate their storage and compute resources. And so going back to, like, if you have, when you're buying hardware for your on-premise or pre-cloud database, when you buy X storage resource, you also are forced into buying X compute resource. Like, they're fixed, right? So you can only ask a certain amount of questions per a certain amount of storage. But like we said before, that's just not how businesses work. You want to ask a lot of questions against a little data, or have a lot of data that you ask few questions about. That's still important to have that data around, even if you're not asking questions all the time of it. That's how businesses work. That's fundamentally at odds with the way that, like, just buying resources work with on-premise solutions and with Redshift, because again, they're porting over that same software that kind of inherits that limitation. So Snowflake says, what if we just went around to all three cloud vendors and we bought was effectively a nearly infinite pool of storage and compute resources from Amazon, Google, and Microsoft cloud solutions at the time. And then we slap on a proprietary software layer on top of that that will perform all kinds of, like, that will dictate, like, the UI that people will use to access those resources. And if that sounds complicated,
and that software is the kind of Snowflake's special sauce software for how to do the compute and the way that they do it. That's, elastic and effective. And but it's this layer on top of rented out storage space from Amazon, Microsoft, and Google.
Exactly. It's actually insane. Like, if you really think it almost doesn't make any sense, and it seems like an incredibly risky thing, which frankly,
it makes me nervous. Yeah, I would be
Yeah.
so nervous as a business owner. And yet clearly it's a business model that has worked for Snowflake.
Exactly. Exactly. And one of the scariest things for them at the time too is that, Google, Amazon, Microsoft all have their version of Amazon's data warehouse, or a competitor to Snowflake. So Snowflake is coming in and saying, hey, why don't we buy an insane amount of resources that underlie one of your big products to make our own competing product of that thing, that we are entirely dependent on your services for our product that competes with yours to work, i.e., you turn the lights off, we're out, right? There's no Snowflake. In other words, Snowflake doesn't own servers, period. Like, they're not, you're never running. Maybe now it's different in certain cases with, high security customers and whatnot, but at that time, Snowflake effectively doesn't own a computer. Like, when you're querying in Snowflake, you're querying off of the hardware that is owned and managed by an entirely different company that competes with Snowflake. Those companies being Google, Amazon, or Microsoft. But so that's like a potential downside and huge risk. But the upside is insane, because what happens when Snowflake goes out and buys all these compute and these storage resources, what they now have access to is basically unlimited flexibility in what they can do with their software on top of that. In the main consequences of this, I think, are, like, super, super simple. And I think about it, I guess there's really four of them. The first is that now that you've separated storage and compute, and you basically have an infinite amount of both of them, and you put your software abstraction on top, from the customer's perspective, they now have an infinite amount of flexibility for how they want to scale either one. So if I'm a customer that wants to have X amount of storage and 100x compute, I can just do that in an instant on Snowflake, and it doesn't matter at all how that's provisioned under the hood.
And
Because
if that same client a week later wants to change that out, they're doing something different with their data, they can suddenly store a lot more data and be doing fewer queries on it.
Exactly.
And then they just get billed by according to their use of each of those resources.
Exactly. So that first premise, like we've separated it out, now you can scale infinitely. It makes it such that you're right. Like as a business, your needs are met just immediately. Whatever your needs are, we can handle them. A lot of data, a lot of compute, a little whatever. It's fine. We can also handle different engineers or whoever using different resources at different times, because you're not all pulling off of the same physical computer. We can actually throw different compute onto the same storage at the same time, and it's all good. You can hire 100 data engineers to ask different questions at the same time, and it's all fine. I won't go into that. That's like a bigger problem that was solved, but that's what people call the concurrency problem. So that's the first thing, is like technically the problem they solve of concurrency. The second consequence of that is exactly what you're saying. Snowflake's like, so if we've totally separated these two and we allow you to scale up and down, then instead of like selling you a bunch of seats or charging you for what you may or may not use of our service, and that's how everyone else worked up to this point. If you're going to buy a bunch of servers up front, or if you're going to buy a bunch of seats on Redshift up front, or whatever, instead, we're going to just do utility-based pricing, consumption-based pricing. Like you said, Mary, whenever you put data into the cloud, we'll just charge you based on that. Whenever you ask questions of it, we'll just charge you based on that. We're not going to charge you a bunch of money up front for what you may or may not use. That was massive. Totally revolutionized the financing.
I'm curious how the market was reacting, in the sense, not the big market, but customers or potential customers, because there's already the shift towards the cloud with something like Amazon Redshift. People are processing that, saying like, is this what we want? I assume they were like, yes, this is what we want. We're shifting to that. And then when Snowflake offers this new model, was it like, yes, this is awesome, or were people skeptical?
I mean, I maybe the proof's in the pudding. So Snowflake went public, what, 2021, 2020? I forget. I was there at the time. I forget. But in the last couple of years, yeah. But so they went public about 6 or 7 years after they were announced as a company at
Right.
over $100 billion valuation. So that so it's the largest software IPO of all time, and
Right.
they
So
did it in less than 10 years.
definitely after a while, people got it. But I'm thinking like
Yeah.
those first months, that first
Yeah.
year. I think I heard you say at one point an anecdote about how Snowflake's initial sales team was like calling up customers. What was that? Like calling up Amazon Redshift customers? How were they? Or maybe you can't say this
Yeah.
publicly.
No, exactly. No, exactly. I mean, at the time, it was kind of a meme, because like if
Okay.
you call up a customer who's on premise, like they're not going to talk to you, right? It's so like if I'm a Snowflake seller, we are just, we at the time were just some randos who are selling like a very performant cloud solution. So if you're selling that to an on-premise person, not interesting. But if you're talking to someone who has Amazon Redshift, that means that they're bought into cloud data warehousing. And at the time, it totally sucks compared to what you're selling. I mean, like light years different. So yeah, I mean, early sales strategy, 100%. You just call up every single person you can think of who's doing data stuff. You ask them if they've got Redshift. If they don't, you say, thanks, have a good day, hang up. And if they do, you talk to them about Snowflake. Simple as that.
Let the Amazon sales team do the work of getting them over to the cloud, and then go after them once they're already on the cloud.
Exactly. I mean, in a sense, like the easiest go to market.
Right. So obviously it's worked. It's an amazing product that that went public and has now become again the heart of sort of this whole industry. Led to this Cambrian explosion of all these other things that you can do with the modern data stack, built to a certain degree around what Snowflake initiated and then inspired among its competitors. To what degree have others, and especially like the big three, Microsoft, Amazon, and Google, caught up to Snowflake?
Yeah. It's a good question also, and I'll hit on
Big question, but
no, it's a good question. And I guess I'll answer just briefly too, to hit on what you said is like the context, and like at this point, who cares? Okay, Snowflake's big, what does it matter? And kind of
Yeah.
maybe from a historical, even though it's 8 years perspective, I think just to like touch on that really briefly, I think the simple reason why Snowflake Matters is interesting is because if you're in the modern data stack, you basically owe your existence to Snowflake. And I know it's like a weird claim, but it's because
That's sounding cultishly.
I know it's weird, but the basic idea is like the modern data stack or a lot of cool data stuff that's happening today around the warehouse. All of their existences are made possible by the fact that you have like separate dedicated compute uh, on a cloud-based warehouse. And it's a lot of buzz termy stuff, but it's as simple as like before Snowflake, like you have like X amount of compute that everyone at that company is fighting for to ask questions with the data. So if you want to pull data in, if you want to query it, if you want to model it, if you want to push it out, if you want to visualize, whatever, everyone's fighting internally to get this with the same resources to attack that data. Once you get this separation of compute that Snowflake really like pushes into the market, and now all the big guys have it too. Now you have the ability for someone like a Fivetran to come in and say, hey, no worries, just spin up a compute resource for Fivetran for your ETL jobs, and we will manage that whole process for you. And then you guys work on the querying. And then you have a DBT who shows up and says, hey, we'll actually provide a layer for your modeling once the data lands, and so on and so forth. So that's, I would say, like the biggest reason why Snowflake is cool. Like you don't have to use Snowflake to think it's cool, but I would say that's really the big thing. And in terms of like who's caught up,
It was the type of technology that opens the door to innovation all around it, I guess.
exactly.
By nature of how it works.
Exactly. And in terms of the other guys, it's a good question. I think this is where I don't know. I mean, I'm not a data practitioner. I can't say, but I will say that certainly Redshift and BigQuery are competitive. So Google's data warehouse, Amazon's data warehouse are big competitors to Snowflake for business users. And then separately, the biggest competitor for Snowflake for data science or machine learning users is a company called Databricks, and they're kind of fighting over that battleground. And again, broad strokes, and generally speaking, Amazon, Google, and Snowflake are fighting over like the business user battleground in the data warehouse space, and they've all kind of caught up in these overall ways. And there's some other contenders like the Firebolts of the world who are coming up and nipping at like very specific use cases within that.
Right. Yeah. No. It was revolutionary in 2014, changed the landscape, opened the door to all these, to, as you said, the modern data stack. I think one of the best anecdotes I've heard about that was from a couple of weeks ago. I had on the show Prakalpa. She's the founder of Atlan, which is a data collaboration tool. And it was something that, like a lot of data tools, it was something that was built internally. She was running a company and they needed a data collaboration tool, and they didn't have one, or there wasn't a good one out there. So they built it and then turned that into a company. But she said, when she and her co-founder were getting things going and getting investment, those first few years, so like, I think it was about 2018, 2019, there wasn't this talk about the modern data stack, or there wasn't like that wasn't yet in the zeitgeist. And it was with the Snowflake IPO that suddenly everything switched, and like this, became this place for innovation, really became a reality. So I think it's absolutely fascinating. Again, from, we'll say, the stealth mode 2012 Snowflake to the launch in 2014, into now with like the full-fledged modern data stack. It's what, 8 years? I guess 10 if you count from stealth mode, and absolutely fascinating history. I think that's a great perspective to bring into the Snowflake conference coming up. We have gone over time. Oh no, we've got a couple more minutes. I'm going to keep you on, Lee, because you work at Hightouch. And so I know that you don't have to go off to something else. They won't be like, you missed the meeting because you were on the data tea. I think that gives great perspective. Of course, we're talking in broad strokes. There's a lot of other little mini steps in the technological development, but understanding that Snowflake brought in the separation of compute and storage, and that really just changed the game for what you can do with data in the data space is pretty amazing. So As we wrap up, let's talk a little about the summit next week. It's going to be super exciting. Obviously, we're going. I think every other member of the Modern Data Stack is going to be there. What are you excited about going into Vegas next week?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I'm excited to see who shows up. I think a bunch of people are going to show up, but for me as a former Snowflake employee, like I'm just excited to see what it's going to look like, really. I mean, so for some context, with the pandemic, Snowflake hasn't put on an in-person summit in years, and that was years before they were public. And so now this is, again, from like putting my Snowflake hat on, this is really kind of crazy and fun to just think that this will be the first kind of real summit, if you will, that Snowflake will have put on as a company since they've been public and since they've been super exciting and talked about by everyone. And so I think that's what I'm most excited to see is like what the consequences of that kind of fame and adoption are going to be in the physical form.
That's interesting. I hadn't realized this was the first post-IPO summit. That's amazing. So is that right? That's wild.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Well, in person, yeah. There were, the last couple of years have been, yeah. But it's
everything's a blur with COVID. That's wild. That's super interesting. Well, I'm excited to be there. And then, of course, now you're wearing a different hat. You're at Hightouch. We do work very closely with Snowflake. And was it today? I believe it's wild. We launched the Snowflake Partner Connect. So now Snowflake users can go in, and if they're also a Hightouch client, they can click on a button and have that integration happen immediately. Is that how it works?
Yeah, exactly. Now you can access Hightouch and data activation directly from the Snowflake UI, which is a very big deal for us at Hightouch. And we're very excited. And I think it's a good example, maybe in like kind of wrapping this with a bow, is the idea that it's a good sign that you've made it when people don't think you're even like that cool anymore. And a good example of that is like Redshift. So right now I look back at Redshift and I'm like, yeah, Redshift sucks because everyone's like Redshift, but better. But that, in a sense, that means that you've made it. It's like asking kids today, like, what about the Beatles? And they'd be like, yeah, they just sound like everyone, but worse. But the reason they sound like everyone is because everyone copied the Beatles. And yeah, they're better because everyone copied the Beatles and came after them. And that's what Redshift is kind of like today. They're kind of like a meme, and they'll get better and they're competitive, but that's really beautiful sign. And Snowflake perhaps now is like, it's like, oh yeah, everyone likes Snowflake, whatever. And maybe there's some competitors that are just better because, they do this and that. But they're getting to the point where like everyone wants to kind of hang out with Snowflake and take it for granted, which is a good sign of like, they really did something special that now they're just kind of in the background and everyone's trying to build off of this storage and separation stuff because it was so impressive. It's almost like a banal point. And that's really a sign of like their success. And we're certainly piggybacking off of that by providing like activation directly from their platform.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know it'll be one thing that I think is interesting about conferences is you get that sense of kind of what's coming next. It might be the little startup that's doing something that seems tangential to all of this now. And, 3 of us go to the talk, and then in 5 years, there might be a summit devoted to, or a conference devoted entirely, to that company, because that's how innovation happens. And Snowflake will increasingly be in the background because it's become a universe of its own. Well, super excited. We will, I will see you next week at the summit, and in a year, maybe we'll do this and see what's happened with Snowflake in the meantime.
Whoa, that'd be nuts.
In this weird, stretched out evolution of technology.
Wow.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Lee.
Thank you, Mary.
Bye.
Bye.